Then good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third of our public debates post the EU referendum. I'm Emily Jones. I'm an associate professor here at the Blavatnik School of Government, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all. We're here this evening to discuss immigration in the age of Brexit. It's perhaps many issues are topical, but this is perhaps a defining one of our time. Obviously, within the Brexit, there was a questions of how much immigration and concerns about immigration were a driver of the vote to leave. This evening, the US has gone to the polls. Of course, immigration is a big issue in the US. It's a sensitive topic and a big issue across Europe, as well as many other countries. So I'm going to introduce four really excellent panelists. And our reason for hosting this debate was really to get some of the facts and figures down to really understand the research and understand what exactly are the facts and figures insofar as we can know them, but also to debate and probe some of the things, the philosophical dimensions, the ethical dimensions, the politics around this. So I hope as you listen to each of our speakers, you'll think through the questions that you have, and then what I'd love us to have is a good sort of 45 minutes to an hour of open discussion with our panelists. As I say, incredibly grateful to all our panelists. We have an exceptional group. First to speak will be Madeleine Sumption, who's director of the Migration Observatory group here in the University of Oxford. Second to speak will be Rob Ford, who's professor of political science, University of Manchester, and author of a book on the Revolt of the Right, which looks at UKIP and the BNP, so the British National Party and the UK Independence Party and their rise. David Goodhart, Head of Demography, Immigration and Integration, Unity and Policy Exchange, and editor of Large at Prospect magazine. And I see your book here, The British Dream, which looks, again, at sort of immigration in the UK in historical context and then thinks towards the future. And my colleague, Tom Simpson, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy and Public Policy here at the Blavatnik School, who reflects on some of the ethical dimensions on immigration. Without further ado, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to speak for about sort of 5 to 8 minutes. Just to let you all know, the debate is being live streamed and will be recorded. And for that reason, we'll ask you to use microphones as well when you ask questions so that it can be captured. I can see people, yes, doing their hair in the front here. Don't worry, it's only the back they can see. It's all of us who have to worry on the panel. Good. So Madeleine, over to you for 8 minutes of your thoughts on these issues.
Thank you. Well, you asked me to talk about facts and figures, and I think the most obvious fact about immigration at the moment is that it is significantly higher than it has been in the past. There are lots of different ways of looking at the scale of immigration. The figures that you'll probably be most familiar with are the net migration statistics that hit the news 4 times a year. Currently, net migration, so that's the number of people coming into the UK for long-term stays, minus the number of people going out, is running at about 330,000, looking at people of all citizenships. And that's gone up from less than 100,000 in the mid-1990s or so. The foreign-born share of the population is another common statistic that we look at. That share has gone up from around about 7% to 14 or 15%. Higher share of people, if you look at the workforce, closer to 17%. And of course, I should say this. We often talk about immigration, particularly when we're talking about statistics. We talk about it as if it's this kind of monolithic category of foreign-born people or foreign citizens. The reasons that people move are extremely diverse. So in that, we have international students, some of whom come and go, some of whom stay in the UK. We have family migrants, people coming for work, people coming as refugees. Those are the main categories. Now, this increase in immigration to the UK over the last 15 or 20 years is partly a result of policy, but partly a result of other factors. One of the policy changes that we've seen, obviously, is the enlargement of the European Union. But we've also seen increases in categories that existed long before 2004, long before the immigration started to increase, like, for example, people coming for work, and people who've had free movement rights for a long time, like European citizens from the Western European member states. So there are also a lot of non-policy factors that have driven the increases of immigration, and we've seen actually analogous increases in many other high-income countries. For example, as a result of the fact that there is now a much bigger market for international study than there used to be and changes in particular global labour markets, particularly in industries like IT, for example. A lot of countries have seen increased immigration of IT workers. So trying to unpick the reasons for the changes that we see is a complicated process. I think we often, as immigration policy people, we often have a tendency to assume that this is all driven by policy. Policy is really important, but it's certainly not the only show in town. In terms of the impact of immigration in the UK, there's been quite a lot of research on this. There are many different types of impacts, and it's very difficult to add them all up into some kind of overall picture where you could generalize and say this is something that's good or bad. Different people will be affected in different ways. Different outcomes that we may care about will be affected differently, whether that's the public finances, outcomes in the labour market for different groups of people, productivity in the UK, public services. So that picture is very complex. I'd be happy to talk about specific components of it more. I think to the extent that we can generalize about these economic impacts of migration is that they tend to be smaller than you might think. So immigration is not the thing that is going to bring down the economy or the thing that is going to rescue it. Often the reality is much more modest. That's not to say that there are particular short-term and localized pressures, particularly in areas that have had higher levels of migration, and particularly in areas that have had unexpectedly high levels of migration where it was more difficult to plan for it. So I'll just say a few things about the future of immigration policy now that we're leaving the EU. And the big question here, and there are lots of different aspects that we could focus on. The big question is what happens to EU citizens coming to work, because that's the area of the immigration system that's likely to change most. And it's also, if you're looking at EU migration, work is the most important motivator currently for people coming to the UK. Essentially, we have three main scenarios. One is a continuation of free movement, which politically seems relatively unlikely at the moment. We have modified variants of free movement where, for example, you might require a job offer or have a cap on the number of people who are able to come in. There are various complications with that we can talk more about. But those are options. They would probably have a relatively modest effect on the overall nature of immigration to the UK. The second main option is a work permit system. This can be designed in any number of different ways, but the idea essentially is the employer would have to apply for a permit to bring someone in for work. So that would require administrative process that would make it more difficult, and there would also probably be various restrictions on who is actually eligible to come in, what types of jobs can be filled, and there are a huge number of decisions that would need to be made in that domain to decide who's going to be eligible and who isn't. And then the final option is a kind of hybrid that's been discussed quite a lot, and it's difficult to know exactly how it will be implemented. But the idea that there might be free movement for some people and a work permit system for others, which would be quite complicated, and we can, I think I won't go into too much detail on that, but we can talk about what that might look like in practice. So I think overall, in terms of the challenges that the government faces when they design the system, there are a huge number of trade-offs and design decisions that are going to need to be made. I want to point to one or maybe one and a half, which is about the trade-off between a system that is fine-tuned to various different policy goals that we may have, and a system that is relatively straightforward and simple, and easy to implement. There's been a lot of discussion about different sectoral immigration policies. So what does financial services need? What does the construction sector need if we're going to build X number of houses? What about the problems in social care? What's the role of immigration there? And there are lots of other government policy objectives that are related to immigration. For example, if you're going to massively reduce the number of people with particular skills, is the UK willing to pay much more for training for people to gain those skills in the UK? So the impacts of restricting EU migration in particular will depend on what other government policies are in place to mitigate those. And I think when we think about how the system might shape up, there is we do risk having an extremely complicated immigration system if we were to try and finally focus immigration policy on all of these different goals that we have for different sectors of the economy. That would make it quite hard to navigate. It would mean that it wasn't necessarily based on hard evidence, because in practice, these things that you can't really decide statistically how you should make some of these decisions. They end up, a lot of them are subjective or political judgments. But a complicated system is one that will feel more responsive to different political objectives across the system. And then the final thing I'll just mention quickly is in the enforceability of immigration rules. If we have a significant restriction on EU citizens' ability to come and work in the UK, a lot of the underlying drivers exist for illegal working. Which is that it will still probably be relatively easy for people to come to the UK. I think the general expectation is that EU citizens will continue to get visa-free travel to arrive here. There are very well-established recruiting networks, family networks, that will make it easier for people to support themselves and find work here. And so there will be a much greater enforcement challenge for the government. And that challenge, I think, could be exacerbated by an extremely complicated immigration system that has sub-quotas for different areas of the economy, where some people have free movement rights and some people don't. And so I think there's an operational challenge that hasn't been discussed a lot in the public debate that I think will become quite important when we start to see the design of a system coming into shape and then eventually being implemented.
Excellent, thank you very much. Can I just press you on two issues, just on the statistics? One is on access to public services. So we saw that was a sort of concern that's been in the papers. So to what extent do we have research about the impact on migration or immigration on access to public services? And the other one was on the target numbers. So so you've given us different scenarios for dealing with EU work-related migration. We've seen the sort of tens of thousands target. Where would any of these lead us vis-a-vis that kind of target?
Yes, so on the question about public services, there's much more research now than there was 5 or 10 years ago, although there's still a lot that we don't know. The impacts are likely to be very different for different types of services. So if you look at health, for example, that's an area where the impact of migration is probably positive because migrants are less likely to be using the health service. They're more likely to be in the younger age groups that tend not to put a lot of demand on healthcare services. And they're also quite likely to be working in the NHS as doctors or nurses. There are other areas like education where it will be the other way around. So we do have a fair number of migrants working as teachers, for example, but it's still a relatively low share of the teaching workforce. And migrants, because they're more likely to be young, are also more likely to be in the kind of childbearing ages, and so immigration affects the youth population quite significantly. On average, in some ways, it all comes down to whether people who are migrating to the country are paying in enough in taxes to cover the cost of those services. And there's some debate on this, but broadly, the evidence suggests that they are, that the fiscal impact of migration is pretty much a wash. On the question about,
you mean neutral?
Is that an Americanism?
Yeah.
Sorry, neutral, very, very close to zero. So on the question about the net migration target, this is, so if you were to reduce net migration of EU citizens to zero, you still wouldn't meet the target currently. So Brexit alone is unlikely to bring, the policy changes resulting from Brexit are unlikely to mean that the target was met. Obviously, there are other things going on. You have economic changes that affect how many people want to come here. You have currency changes that may reduce the desirability of the UK for work, may increase the desirability for international students because it's cheaper now for international students to come here. And then there's big uncertainty about the data, particularly when we're trying to, overall the aggregate data on net migration appear to be roughly accurate. But when you're picking apart particular policy categories like international students, for example, there's actually a lot of uncertainty about what the contributions of different groups are for net migration, which puts the government in a tricky position because they have to make policy without fully knowing how the different policy channels that they have to manipulate are actually going to affect net migration at the end of the day. So it's a difficult one.
And as we've seen, numbers have been quite salient in the political or the sort of public perceptions, which probably is a good segue to you, Rob, on the question of public perceptions of migration, how that's fed into the Brexit debate.
Yes, I've spent much of the past 10 years, amongst other things, researching public opinion on migration and the political impact of migration. In the time that we've got, I'm going to have to paint with a little bit of a broad brush, but I'm going to ask and try to answer 3 questions, 2 of which I think are relatively easy questions in the sense that the answer coming from public opinion data is relatively clear. It doesn't mean it's easy to implement, but it's easy to see what the public want. The 3rd question is the hard question, which I think Brexit won't resolve. So the first relatively easy question is, did immigration play a role in the Brexit vote, and if so, why? The answer is a very clear yes, pretty much however you choose to measure it. If you look at people's open-ended responses in terms of what influenced their vote, immigration is named a lot. A lot of other people say sovereignty, but that's actually quite closely intertwined with immigration because they want to take back control. What is it they want to take back control of? The borders, the immigration system, and so forth is one of the most frequently cited answers there. So it clearly played a very large role in the motivation to vote to leave the EU. Now, why was that? Again, it's not a very difficult question to answer. Really, you only have to go back to 2004 and the fateful decision by Prime Minister Blair to grant the accession countries full and unfettered access to the British labour market, or rather his failure to anticipate that the other countries in Western Europe would not do the same. If Germany and France and Italy and the Netherlands and so on had opened their borders at the same time, then we might be having a very different discussion right now. Because what's very clear in the data, one of my colleagues here at Oxford has analysed it, Jeff Evans, is that the relationship between views of the EU and views of immigration, which was essentially nil the last time we voted on EU membership in 1975, became steadily stronger from 2004 onwards, relentlessly so, in fact, such that by 2016, I wouldn't even need to ask you a question about Europe to know how you felt about Europe. I could just ask you a question about immigration and read the answer straight across to how you'd feel about Europe. It was almost a one-to-one relationship by that point. And again, it's because the voters were not fools. They came to realise that a big segment, as Madeleine said, not a total segment, but a big segment of the migration that was coming into the country was coming from Europe. And they knew, although politicians tried to avoid telling them so, that that segment of the migration inflow could not be controlled whilst we remained members of the European Union. So they drew the obvious conclusion, which was if they wanted migration numbers to come down, and they did, that would require leaving the European Union unless the European Union's view on migration changed, which they made very clear during the referendum debate it wasn't going to. So the voters did exactly what you would expect given their preferences. It's often said that voters are ignorant. I think that sometimes on the detail they are, but in the broad brush of what they want and how to get it, they often show a quite surprising degree of wisdom, rather more than policymakers would like them to in some instances. So in that sense, it's not a difficult question to answer. The second question is, well, what kind of a migration system would voters like? Do they have a clear sense of what they would like migration in Britain to look like? And again, there is a clear and pretty unambiguous answer that emerges from the data when we look at this. It's quite simple, really. What voters want is migrants who they think will make a clear contribution to Britain, and anything that they that straightforwardly predicts greater support for migrants. So student migrants are strongly positively supported. Professional migrants are strongly supported. People with job offers are supported more strongly than people who come without job offers. And the segments of migration that attract the greatest public resistance are unskilled workers, asylum seekers, and family reunion migrants, in all of which cases there are obviously other reasons that Britain might accept such migrants, humanitarian, rights-based and so on. But in all those cases, the economic case is less clear, and the public responds by being less keen on allowing those people in, all else being equal. The other thing that comes up a lot in the migration debate is, well, what role does identity and ethnicity play in this? Well, it plays a big role in the hard question that I'm going to come on to, but less of a role in this area, or rather less of a broad brush role than we might expect. So if you, and I've done these kinds of experiments in survey data, if you ask people about professional migrants or students, the public in Britain don't care where professionals coming to staff the NHS come from. They're as happy to accept a doctor from Pakistan as they are to accept a doctor from Poland, and in both cases that is in fact pretty happy. The same with students coming to study in our universities. They're quite happy for students to come from anywhere in the world, provided they're high quality students. When you look at the other end of the labour market, that's where you find identity distinctions cropping up. People are keener, if we're going to accept unskilled labour, they would rather it came from Europe than came from elsewhere in the world. Incidentally, that what I've called in past research ethnic hierarchy, that preference for groups that are culturally, racially more similar to us than those that are more different, has always existed in the data, but has actually become steadily smaller over time, and the very high immigration that we've had over the past 10 years has not reversed that trend. So to sum it up, if we were to design an immigration system from scratch around public opinion, it would be heavily skill biased, it would have a heavy element of central control, it would focus heavily on economic contribution, and one other thing which I forgot to discuss briefly is the immigrants and the welfare state. The British public basically regards the welfare state as a club that you have to pay money into before you get full access to the benefits. They do not think migrants should not have access to that club in perpetuity, but nor do they think that migrants should have access to that club from day one. The amount of time that they want migrants to be chipping in before the club's doors open varies a fair amount, but less than you might expect. You can get 70% of the public falling between 1 year and 5 years. The problem was, in the debate over the EU, the offer was 0 years, which is essentially where nobody in the British public is. It was not a reasonable position as far as they were concerned. They don't tend to think of the welfare state as a set of unlimited rights. They think of it as a contributory system. And as soon as the contributory principle comes in, they become relatively liberal relatively quickly. I mean, obviously, whether you think 3, 5, 2 years is reasonable is something that can be debated. But that's where the public is. They are in that sort of ground. They are not no way, no how, nor are they straight away. They're in between. So what about the hard question? Well, the hard question is actually one that David asked over a decade ago, and is one of the reasons I ended up researching this topic, because he asked it in an essay in Prospect whilst I was doing my master's degree. And I've spent much of the past decade trying to answer it, not necessarily with great effect. And the way David posed it was too diverse, question mark. I might pose it a little bit differently. I mean, it's getting posed in loads of ways now, post-Brexit, but we could ask about the debate, homogeneity versus diversity, community versus individual liberty, local versus global, change as a source of hope versus change as a source of anxiety, mobility as an important source of strength versus stability as an important source of strength. All of these ways of framing it have been put out there in the past couple of years. But what they're all getting at is a basic and really hard problem in our politics right now, which is that there are two sets of values out there. What's often called a more communitarian set of values, where you're looking at tradition and stability and identity, and where change is something that makes you anxious, versus a socially liberal set of values where dynamism and freedom to move around and global outlook and cosmopolitanism are the virtues you aim for. Now, the important point about this is both of those are valid sets of social goals, nor can one put one of those outlooks above the other. They're just different and fundamentally incompatible. You can't simultaneously be stable and dynamic. You can't simultaneously slow change down and speed it up. You can't simultaneously be mobile and stay put. And the problem we have is that the voters in our society split very deeply on these issues, and immigration has very much catalysed that split and made it much more salient for the way that they think about politics and the way that they vote. We're going to see that again tonight in the US election, where for the first time in history it is likely that white university graduates will vote for the Democrats, while whites who left school without qualifications vote very heavily for Mr. Trump. Exactly the same split, incidentally, that we now see in left-right voting in this country. And the problem, why this is the hard problem, is it's very easy to pose this divide. It's very difficult to resolve it, because the two parties we have in this country, at least, were built around a very different divide about the role of the state and the role of the market, and they are internally divided. There are liberals and communitarians in the Labour Party. There are liberals and communitarians in the Conservative Party. And the problem we have going forward is that even if we come up with a good solution to the thorny questions of Brexit and immigration, the even thornier questions of which values should predominate and which direction our society should go in will still be there. And now that they're mobilised into politics, I don't think it's very easy to put the genie back into the bottle, nor do I see I don't see exactly how either of the main parties is going to be able to address those questions, given that those questions divide the parties against themselves. It is not easy for either party to take a firm position on these issues without antagonising an important part of its coalition.
Thank you, Rob. Can I just push you a little bit on this question of these different values and how much inequality in the UK has sort of fed into some of those sort of more communitarian, wanting stability, worried about dynamism, because none of us have values that are permanent, right? They shift over time. So to what extent has economic inequality perhaps played into that? So the sort of left behind voters are the ones that then hold on to these values and perhaps they're more salient, i.e. have we had a more distributive political system? Might the values have shifted? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that this divide exists in less unequal societies too, and they are wrestling with it in the same way. If you look at Sweden, which has a much more comprehensive welfare state, you're seeing... I mean, the thing you have to remember about when you look at the politics of this issue and these issues in a place like Sweden or a place like the Netherlands is that they're starting 20 years back from where we started. The change process is later for them. Mass migration to Sweden started in the 90s, not in the 60s like here. But in Sweden you have the same kind of voters, older, white, working class, socially conservative voters going over to the Sweden Democrats, despite the existence of a comprehensive welfare state. I actually think the problem is not economic inequality so much as... I do think that the sense that you have been left behind and left out feeds in to this social conservatism and this desire to turn the clock back. But the problem, as it were, is at the other end. It's that the socially liberal groups in society have been the ones that have been growing, and they've been the ones that have been succeeding. And so they now see these issues through the lens of social liberalism. And if you look at, for example, the young activists who join the left in Europe now, their primary values are social liberal values: cosmopolitanism, diversity, anti-racism. The economic issues that still structure the worldview of these older generations are secondary to them. And if these two things come into conflict, the resolution is a lot easier for the young than I think it is for the old.
The older generation. Thank you. David, let's turn to you and your thoughts on
let me just pick up on what Rob was saying, because I agree very much with what he was saying about these new divides. Well, they're not really new divides. But as Rob was saying, the scale of the liberal group, the kind of people from nowhere, the people from nowhere is perhaps a subset of this liberal group. Their numbers have been growing, it's true, but they're still really quite a small minority. I think what's happened in the last generation or so is that they have asserted their power. You might say we have asserted our power without the... we've considered our own interests and preferences to be the national interest and the national preference. And we have just been told in the Brexit vote that this is not in fact the case. As Rob said, the divisions are rather neatly illustrated, I think, by the attitudes to large-scale immigration. I mean, like I think the last big British social attitude survey report was done in 2013 or 2014, but I mean, it's reproduced, I think, in most surveys. About 50% of the population, perhaps a bit more than that, 55% of the population, think that immigration is far too high. About another 22% think it's a little bit too high. And then there's a sort of liberal 20% or so, which think it's either about right or not high enough. I mean, they are a slightly eccentric 5%. And I think that you see those proportions cropping up time and time again in the surveys across a whole range of subjects that you might call the security and identity subjects. And I think what's happened in British society is in the last generation we've had what I call the two masses have come together. Mass immigration, because actually we weren't a mass immigration society even as late as the 1990s. I mean, it's really the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, and particularly 2004, has made us a mass immigration society. I mean, the kind of scale that Madeleine was talking about earlier. We had already become a multiracial society back with post-colonial immigration in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We were not a mass immigration society. We have become, in the last generation, a mass immigration society, and at the same time, we've become a mass higher education society. And I think those two things coming together have substantially sort of changed the balance of forces in our society, and have reduced the status of a huge range of non-graduate employment at the same time as at least some people are faced by a kind of in-your-face globalization. I mean, it's one thing when your factory closes and moves to China, but when actually a whole reserve army of labor from Romania and Bulgaria arrives in your own country to compete against you, that is really rather a different thing and historically unprecedented. I think the distinction that Rob was talking about plays out in identity terms, I think, very there's this famous, I think it's Talcott Parsons' distinction between achieved and ascribed identities. People like us, people who have passed exams when they were young, gone to good universities, had good professional jobs, have what is called achieved identities, and these are identities that are easily portable. It gives you social confidence. You can move anywhere, or you can live in parts of town where there's a very high churn and you're not discombobulated by that. But the 50% of people who say immigration is far too high, perhaps a few more on top of that, generally have what are called ascribed identities. Therefore, their identity comes from place and group, and they're a Scottish farmer or they're a Cornish housewife or whatever. They're connected to certain functions. And I think that has been important too, and that distinction has become a bigger one in our society. So I think Rob is a bit pessimistic about this. I mean, I think it is the central task of politics now, actually, over the next generation, to create a new settlement between the people from nowhere and the people from somewhere, if you like. And I think that is going to be very difficult given the party configuration, but not necessarily impossible. And I actually think this government, more than most in recent times, has the sort of intellectual capacity to, or rather the sort of value capacity to perhaps achieve that, or at least to point us in that sort of direction. I just wanted to talk. I actually prepared thoughts on something else, really, which is well, actually, it is one way of squaring the circle. Let's try and be a bit more optimistic and constructive. I do think one way of squaring the circle on the immigration issue itself is through developing a kind of modern 21st century civilized form of guest worker system, if you like. The Gastarbeiter system in Germany has a very bad reputation, but a lot of that, I think, was to do with the peculiarities of Germany in the 1950s and the 1960s. the way of squaring the circle between the need for some continuing, I mean, even if we all accept that immigration in general will have to come down to more moderate levels, I mean, hardly anybody wants it to stop. They're obviously hugely important. You know, we're an open, you know, we will remain, we are an incredibly open society, actually. I mean, both by international standards and by relation to our own past. We are probably going to become a little less open, but we're going to remain an extremely open society, I think it's fair to say. We are going to reinforce, I think, some of the national social contracts, if you like, that have been allowed to become eroded. I mean, employers are going to have to change their behaviour somewhat. They're not going to have such easy access to the reserve army of labour that they have had, and they're going to have to jolly well train a few more people, something that they haven't done particularly well in the last generation. But as I say, I think we're going to remain a very open society, but we will. We need to square the circle between the need for the economic need and indeed the cultural need for continuing somewhat more moderate flows from outside, with the perfectly legitimate desire to bring numbers down. And I think the way we do that is through making much clearer the distinction between people who are coming temporarily and people who are coming more permanently. Now, I mean, there is already this distinction. I mean, and actually, if you look at the flows in recent years, a very large proportion of it is quite temporary. And it's not reflected in the immigration stats that we have. Like, someone counts as an immigrant if they're coming for a year or more. But lots of people come for 3 years or 4 years and then go home. And, you know, I mean, if somebody sees a Chinese student, say, they don't really sort of think of them as an immigrant in a way. They think of them as someone who's coming here, you know, paying lots of money, getting a good education, we hope, going back to rule the world. And they don't, you know, there's no sense that, you know, that it sort of doesn't matter if they're only living amongst Chinese students and not joining in. There isn't a kind of integration problem. There isn't a kind of a contribution issue generally, because they are contributing. But I think there are lots of other groups where that doesn't apply, including East European groups, people who kind of use the country and the economy in a sort of more transactional way, and yet have the full rights, effectively have the full rights of citizenship. So I think, and this is one of the directions that I think we'll have to go in the context of Brexit, is having a much clearer distinction between temporary and permanent. And then, you know, we can concentrate all the sort of resources, people who are coming here permanently. You know, we can make sure that we concentrate integration resources, you know, language lessons and so on people who are here permanently, and help with the often rather slow and difficult process of integration, and reassure people that you know, if we have a clearer temporary permanent distinction, I think we kind of ring fence the welfare state. We ring fence ideas of national citizenship. You know, and we can be kind of open and welcoming to people from all over the world who are coming here to become, who, you know, to join us, to join the club. I mean, there are difficulties with this and the whole direction of human rights legislation and so on over the last generation has been to reduce the distinction between citizen and non-citizen. And I think, you know, we need to reverse that actually, if we are to remain a healthily, you know, open society while responding to the legitimate anxieties we've been talking about.
Can I just ask one question? Perhaps we can bring it up, perhaps don't answer now, but for us in the discussion, which is it seems to be a little bit of a gap between what you and Rob are saying on the one hand about sort of the need to contribute and sort of immigrants being welcome in the public perception if they contribute economically, and the facts and figures which you've sort of suggested actually there isn't a negative impact economically. Does that make sense? So the kind of perception is a lot of this immigration is costing us economically, but the facts of the matter don't necessarily bear that out. So there seems to be a little bit of slippage between public perception and then...
Well, yeah,
the
but
facts?
I mean, I think it's not. People aren't just economistic. I mean, this is one of the. I mean, the people from nowhere often think very economistically and very individualistically. I think the people at the bottom 50% often have a kind of stronger sense of the society. They think there is such a thing as society, and you look at the extraordinary changes to London and Birmingham in the last 30 years. Just extraordinary changes, demographic, architectural, everything. This is not. This is not what happens in a stable, well-ordered society, which is what most people want to live in.
Back to the values question rather than the economics. I'm going to bring in Tom on this question, because you sort of want to talk through and reflect on some of the philosophical questions at stake. If you'd like to do that, and then we'll open up to the audience.
Great. Well, I'll be try and be very brief, because I'm sure we all want to open up. The impossible has happened. We're having a panel discussion of immigration, one of these hot-button issues, and I see sort of heads nodding at the back, and I don't quite know how we got here. So we were actually I was last here on about a week after the referendum, and we had a very, very, not just full auditorium, but a very tense auditorium. As I'm sure you remember, passions were very high at that stage. And as a philosopher, I just wanted to pick up this distinction between what you might call preferences for a heterogeneous, diverse society and preferences for a homogeneous, stable society. And I'm assuming that I'm speaking to an audience who are dominantly for the former. Clearly, we've got an international audience here, which is fantastic, and also an Oxford audience, which is dominantly preferring that heterogeneous, diverse perspective. So I'd just like to try and outline a couple of considerations for why you might be attracted to the first. I don't think it's enough. I think it is the case that both are legitimate preferences in a country, but to really understand the other side, you need to have a sense for why those might be valuable. So I just want to make 2 points. My assumption is that the power to control borders is a fundamental sovereign prerogative of a self-governing nation. And in that, it's the same as the power to wage war, the power to raise taxes, and the power to set law. Now, all of those things, when you think about them, are quite nasty things to do. Okay, so waging war involves going and killing people. And setting laws involves stating rules that you're going to require them to abide by, whether they want to or not. And taxes, likewise, it's setting rules by which you will appropriate money from them, whether they want to or not. And the justification for all of those policies depends on their serving a collective purpose. And you don't need to think too hard to see what the collective purpose is that each of those serve. So the question we need to ask in the immigration case, the power to control borders, is what purposes does that power serve? And I want to suggest that the first one is that they help a country to sustain a culture, and the second is that they help a country to sustain cultures of trust among its residents. So it's just a fact about the kind of beings that we are, the kinds of people that we are, that in context of stability, stability of place and stability of people who we're living among, that we develop in different and diverse directions. And part of that is that it enables us to belong in a place, enables us to feel connected, not just with our immediate nuclear family, not just with our neighbours, not just with our towns, but with the wider communities in which we're also part. And it's only if you have a certain level of stability that you get the diversity of cultures. So let me put it this way. It's a really closed culture. It's an insular culture that is unable to welcome strangers. Okay, I want to be part of a culture that welcomes strangers, welcomes the incomer. But it's a condition on there being a culture that can do that not everyone is a stranger. There needs to be a sense of being at home together for there to be a culture to welcome people. And the second thing that stability of population enables is it sustains trust. So it's a really awkward fact in social science that humans, we respond to difference with distrust. And it just takes us a while to get over that. And that's probably just an inherited evolutionary it used to be adaptive in a different era of our history, but is no longer adaptive. And it just takes us a while to learn not to distrust the people that we live with who seem different. But I think more importantly, culture gives us habits and norms which profoundly shape the way we interact with others. And in contexts where there's very large-scale changes of population, there's a kind of unsettledness and uncertainty that comes from not knowing what the habits and what the norms are that the people you live amongst are conforming to. And in that context, it just becomes harder to place trust because you don't know what the basis is on which you are extending trust and the basis of what the expectations are. So what are the policy applications of this? Just very briefly in closing. All of the points I've made you'll have seen are totally independent, in particular of race, which is something which has made it very difficult to discuss this issue in the past because we're very sensitive, and obviously rightly so, to histories of racism, and that's categorically what we want to avoid. What they do show, what they point to, is that one of the key considerations as a country sets its policy on immigration is the capacity for that country to assimilate people who are joining. And factors here will be very sensitive to very specific empirical factors. One is the degree of cultural difference between the host country and the country that an immigrant has come from. Another is the willingness to integrate. So some cultures will be more or less self-defining and more or less responsive to the expectation to integrate. And then finally, there's the level of expectation in a host country on assimilation. And Britain in the past has had a very, very strong multicultural policy which has effectively placed no expectations whatsoever on assimilation. And therefore there's a sense of communities existing side by side but without any shared project among them. And that too affects the capacity for a country to welcome immigration. So there are just some considerations. I don't know what side of the fence you're on, but some of these things seem to be very deeply psychologically rooted, and part of the project, very much the shadow of Trump is kind of looming, looming very badly. And we really want to generate a politics that enables people to bridge the divide and understand, just at a kind of deep psychological level, where the other is coming from.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just ask two quick follow-up questions. Perhaps one not to answer, but to seed a thought in all of us, is just to be wary of the underlying assumption that somehow there's a British identity, right? I'm just thinking, again, the diversity that all of us have. We're a rich nation of immigrants, actually, over many, many generations and historically. So sort of thinking about how diverse we are as a country in terms of our origins. And thinking again of just the question of the Brexit vote it was an English vote much more than a Scottish vote or an Irish, and a Welsh rather than Irish. But again, thinking again about sort of not being careful to distinguish between Britain, England, and whose identity are we really talking about here, and being respectful of sort of the idea that we've got minority identities within Britain who aren't sort of outsiders. They're people who've come from many generations. So there's a complexity there. But the question I wanted to push you on a little bit, Tom, was our moral obligation to others from outside. Right, so you've talked about the need for sort of defining our own boundaries, but what then, from a philosophical point of view, is our duty to asylum seekers or those fleeing war, fleeing persecution, and how should that shape then our immigration policy and our thoughts on that?
Well, just very quickly, obviously there's a distinction between refugees and people who are immigrating, seeking to migrate for non-refugee reasons, as it were, which is then a whole range of things. So some of those are economic. Well, there tend to be economic drivers, won't they? And the obligations clearly are different. So there's a general obligation on the international community to provide for refugees and to seek to ameliorate the conditions that lead to refugees. One of the issues of international law is that general duty, global duty, is very poorly distributed in terms of positive duties under international law, and that's a very serious question. If I can just rather than speaking just in the abstract, let me speak in the very particular. Britain's actually been very, very responsive to the current Syrian crisis. It's the second largest donor internationally, 2.3 billion is committed through DFID to solving the Syrian crisis. And the bang for your buck, if we can use a military term, is 10 to 1. It's approximately that. So for every 10 pounds that it would take to provide for a refugee, say a Syrian refugee in the UK, you'll, rather the other way around, so you'll...
your pounds go further.
Your pounds go far further, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, by a 10 to 1 ratio.
Okay.
So the solution to the problems for the Middle East, which are desperate, is not for the Middle East to move to Europe. The solution for the problems for the Middle East is to make the Middle East a secure, stable, prosperous part of the world.
Okay, on that provocative thought, I'd like us to open up. Let's take perhaps 3 questions at a time. The microphone's coming round, and then we'll, or maybe 3 to 5, and then we'll take it from there and come back to our panel. Right, the ladies next to you.
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. I've got sort of more systemic questions, maybe not just about the UK, but also how similar phenomena across different European countries might affect political landscapes there. So one of you said that actually current mainstream political parties won't be able to bridge these divides because they're internal to them. And does that mean that we might observe the emergence of new political parties trying to grapple with these? Would that lead to lots of political instability? If especially we think that they've come, probably these problems have been introduced as value divides by challenger parties like UKIP from the outside.
So what does the political future look like? Great, thank you. Another question, this gentleman. And then the lady in the pink.
Yeah, it's a question about Gastarbeiter regimes, but also about the trade-off between economic and civic dimensions of migration. Is there not a risk that by having a highly segregated and structured system of migration, you make it harder to integrate workers who may come in on a temporary basis, but as in the German case, stay for a very, very long time and form the backbone of ethnic minority communities in Germany, and that paradoxically, the greater rights you give to migrants, the easier it will be to increase their civic commitment to the communities that we live in?
Great, thank you. Question of design there, sort of Gastarbeiter or temporary working schemes. Yeah.
My question is really just refers to one word I haven't heard, I don't think, said at all. It's the word education. How does education impact on people's attitude to immigration?
And what's your interest in that question? What's your...
It's general. I live locally, I'm interested, actually born abroad, and I just wonder to what extent in this country there is a huge divide between educated people who voted and less educated people.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think that comes back to some things David was talking about. Yeah, gentleman in green, and then the gentleman at the front here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you. The question I have really is, was raised by our last speaker. It was the only speaker who mentioned the issue of racism. And in terms of post-Brexit, we have seen at least a reported rise in racist incidents. And certainly I would like to ask the panel, what type of policy would they envisage to counter racism in all its forms in the coming period?
Important question for all of us, I think, at the moment. Yeah, gentleman at the front here. Thank you.
My question relates to a comment that I think David actually said to yourself, Emily, and it's when he said, why is it always economics? Because I think one of the main problems and one of the main reasons why we saw many people supporting the Brexit movement, and again, very similarly with Trump in America, is that not only do people feel that they are underworked due to the footloose nature of international business, but also I think that there is a severe lack of link between workers and a sense of identity as reflected by how they've grown up in their communities and almost performing their identity in the workplace and relating that to a sense of nationalism. So I wondered, has economics become above politics, and why is it always economics, and what about the social issues?
Important questions. Right, should we go in reverse order for our speakers?
Okay.
Or Wait, let's go, because Madeleine hasn't spoken for a while. Let's go in the same order as which you spoke. Let's bring you in first,
Okay.
then, Madeleine.
I'll say something quickly about the temporary migration question and integration. I mean, we see very clearly that if you look in the data, the outcomes that we generally try and use to measure integration, like the type, employment rates or the skill level of someone's job or their language proficiency, we see that these outcomes tend to improve over time. But there's so the question, this question is, do we need? Well, first question is, do we need people to be here a long time in order to integrate? And if you have a system where some people are permanent, but then you have a constantly rotating pool of people who are temporary, what does that mean for integration? You will. And there's a big debate. I don't think there's a clear answer to this. There's been some research on kind of the local impacts of immigration and churn. There is a concern that people who are inherently temporary will not make the kind of investments that are needed to understand whether it's kind of learning English and gaining local skills, or whether it's just more basic stuff in terms of how to fit in locally, where to put their recycling, all of those types of things. I think one of the if you're going to have a system where you deliberately restrict people's rights to stay permanently, the question is, will we see a lower effort on the part of those people to integrate, and then if they end up staying permanently, will that be a problem? I think this is something, I haven't seen any evidence on it. I mean, I think it's something that theoretically ought to be the case, although we should bear in mind that a lot of people, when they initially come, don't actually know whether they're going to stay temporarily or permanently. And that's been the case with many of the people who came from Eastern European countries. They thought that they were here temporarily, and then, life is sticky, and it's hard, the longer you stay, the harder it becomes to move, because you build up networks and you build up a life, and you have children and they're in school, and eventually it's completely inconceivable that you're going to be able to move anyway. So it may actually, having a temporary system may actually mirror some of the dynamics that already exist. I think another important question, and this comes back to some of the stuff David was talking about, is what kind of rights we restrict when we have a temporary migration program, because you have. There are some economic rights that you might want to restrict, like, for example, someone's ability to move. If someone's selected for a particular job because we think that that's necessary, there's a demand for agricultural workers, for example. Do we allow them to move between employers, maybe move out of agriculture entirely? Those are the kind of things that may improve someone's integration in the long run, but it may be contrary to the goal of the policy, which was to bring in agricultural workers. So there you would potentially, if you restricted those economic rights for a long time, you would expect to see worse economic integration. So I think there's a difficult question about how long, kind of what is the phase-in period after which you say, okay, we're going to give people more rights in order to facilitate their integration. Is it 1 or 2 years? Is it up to 5 years? I think there's a kind of sliding scale that's quite difficult to navigate.
Rob.
Golly, there's a lot of questions to try and get through there. I'll try and knit them together into a vaguely coherent response. I'll start with education. I guess that's a good point to start with. Education predicts views of immigration very strongly, but very often, particularly those at the sort of liberal graduate end of this, tend to misinterpret that relationship as one of ignorance and enlightenment. I think that's a mistake, actually. I think, in fact, what you see there is education tracks very closely these liberal cosmopolitan versus socially conservative localist values quite closely. Also, David's point about achieved and ascribed identities is relevant here. We live in a world where there is increasingly a moat around the high status elements of the social structure, and that moat is called the university. If you don't go to it, you don't get into the castle. And the voters at the lower end of the spectrum therefore have to find value elsewhere. So that also feeds into the relationship. And of course, it doesn't help if you have people stuck outside the castle and cut off from the moat to say to them, you're ignorant, when they don't share the views. So there is a strong relationship. And then it feeds into this issue of social values and party divides. yes, fragmentation is the likely consequence of this, and yes, that's already happened in many parts of Europe where there are proportional electoral systems. The problem we have in this country is that we are trapped with an electoral system that is going to force people with these different values to attempt to work together. And I'll give you a little story to illustrate why this is difficult and problematic. So the first time I presented my research on UKIP, I explained to a room of young Labour activists, good, socially liberal, committed social justice people, lovely people, and I said to them the typical UKIP voter is the kind of person who 30 or 40 years ago should have been a typical Labour voter. They're socially deprived, they lack qualifications, they're economically struggling, they're insecure, they want the state to help, but they also really don't like immigration and they're strongly nationalist. And the first question I got from the audience from a lovely person, had a nice chat with them afterwards, was, shouldn't we go and tell these people that they're racist? Should we not call out their racism? And I said, well, should we run through that for a minute? You want to drive all the way up from Manchester or London to Grimsby or Sunderland, knock on this person's door, they've not heard from somebody in politics for years, and say to them, hello, I'm from the Labour Party, you're a racist, please vote for us. It's not going to work. But the problem is that that's the primary value for the young socially liberal people, and they're not wrong to have that as a primary value. To come back to the issue of racism after Brexit, as it follows on from that, I don't think actually, I'm an optimist on the issue of racial attitudes in Britain. It was one of the first things I researched. I think that we are becoming a steadily more liberal society on this question. What I think happened after Brexit, and it is something that needs some pushing back against, is that the segment of the public that is quite racially intolerant, 10, 20% on most measures, took the 52% vote as a 52% endorsement for their worldview. So it emboldened them. And therefore you saw them expressing this publicly in behaviour and attitudes in a way that we haven't seen for a while. And that illustrates, in my view, the solution, which is it's to do with social norms. If you define the boundaries of what's unacceptable, you say to judge people based upon the colour of their skin, the religion they follow, is wrong. You set that boundary. That, in the long run, is how you do the work. And the problem with the Brexit vote is the people on the other side of that boundary misunderstood or misinterpreted what it meant. And I do think it's incumbent on our political elites to push back against that and make clear that is not what the 52% vote meant. I feel I've been talking for a while now, so I'll probably stop on that one.
Thank you. David, let me bring you in.
Well, perhaps on that point, I mean, on the racism issue, I mean, there is, well, perhaps it's not as many as 20%, is it? I mean, perhaps sort of 5% of the population are kind of openly racist. I mean, you know, you really can describe them as bigots. They've always been there, and they probably always will be there. And as you say, I think they were kind of emboldened. But I still want to blame the Liberals. I mean, you know, we have had liberal overreach. The Nowhere people have had it too much their own way, and they have created a backlash. Populism is I think, legitimate response. It's a legitimate readjustment of the politics of this country.
Precisely. What is the liberal overreach that you're talking about?
Well, just what's happened in the last 20 years. I mean, we've become a mass immigration society without anybody being asked about it. We have integrated deeper into the European Union. Our economy has become much more open. I mean, some of these things are inevitable, but some of them are not. I mean, we're now, you know, the world is now sort of deglobalizing somewhat. I mean, not radically, I don't think. It's adjusting, partly because of the kind of UKIPs and the Front Nationals that have you know, impinged on the consciousness of people in the chancelleries of Europe and indeed North America. Back in the early 90s, you know, when, you know, the possibly last time that social democracy went through a great revival with Robert Reich and Clinton in America and then New Labour here, it was, you know, we must roll with the punches of globalization, but don't worry, you people, you know, up in Sunderland and Middlesbrough. We will retrain you. We will sort things out for you. Well, we simply didn't do that. In 1992, we destroyed our 35 polytechnics. ICI was almost as good and big a chemical company as BASF. ICI no longer exists. Many of the companies that formed it, I mean, you know, these are peculiarities of the British system. We have a...
comes back to sort of economics and jobs. Sort of,
well, yeah, I mean, it's to do
well
with the, you know, our system of corporate governance and the importance of the stock market in the British system means that we have these radical discontinuities for many of our big companies in a way that you do not have in. I mean, BASF is now the biggest chemical company in the world, and as I say, you know, they are weeping on Teesside. You know, if you explain what has happened to BASF and what could have happened to ICI. ICI had these amazing laboratories that produced, you know, all sorts of, you know, polythene and plastic and, you know, internal wall cavities and Dulux paint.
And the jobs that would have been there perhaps for your crowd.
Anyway, I mean, I don't want to get too romantic about ICI.
Some people in the audience wanting to come in. So if that's all right, Tom, you can be first to answer next time around. Let's get some more questions, and then I'm going to hand the floor to you. Yeah, let's take this question here. 1, 2, 3. We've got a load of questions. We're going to sweep them all up. Yeah.
Thank you. Željko Ivanović, I'm one of the students at Blavatnik and otherwise working with Open Society Foundations. So I liked very much what you, Professor Ford, said about the divide between the two values, one communitarian, another one liberal. And I think it's not unique for our time. This divide was there already. It's not unique for UK, and I expect that we will see this in the French and German elections next year very much. And these elections, sometimes when you put the values in this binary form, it's almost like a referendum every time. But I wanted to probe a little bit this question of communitarian values that maybe you, Professor Simpson, also alluded to. When you said that after some time people start trusting each other, and that to me suggests that there is a linear relationship there, which I don't think so. Let's say Roma, or here in UK, Gypsies called, they are never good enough for centuries to be recognized as part of the community. So these communitarian values, I think, are problematic because the borders of what a community means and borders of a nation state are not the same borders. So there are still British citizens who are not good enough yet to be part of the community, and there are borders of the UK that ought to be protected. So I just wanted your comments on this. And I also think that the statement that was mentioned about Romanians don't contribute enough is to a certain degree problematic in my view. I'm not Romanian, but I find something utterly wrong with the statement itself. But I guess it was just a statement in passing.
This is the question, I think, with all the immigration debates, to be very careful about making any kind of generalizations and being very careful to stick to the facts. Let's keep going around. Yeah. Gentleman at the back there.
Thanks a lot. I guess in a way it builds off Zelko's question, and it's particularly to you, Tom. I understand the proposition about trust and creating trust, but just wondering if you can illuminate a bit more what you see as the threshold or the qualitative difference between different types of difference. So in what way is the cultural differences between, let's say, English people and non-English people more relevant in this context than the differences which exist very starkly within society in terms of class or socioeconomic status or what have you, and how we decide at a given point which are the areas of trust we need to work on and which we don't need to work on, and is it that just we have to limit the vectors of difference to a manageable number, or how would you see it?
So the real questions there of identity and whether we've got multiple and overlapping identities as well.
Actually, as I've got the microphone, I can make a quick comment. This word immigration has been mentioned a lot, but I haven't really heard the word jobs mentioned. And, you know, people are saying the Brexit is about immigration, but I would say it's more about loss of jobs. You know, the sort of people who are losing jobs, not people at the top, but the tradesmen, those sort of people.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. One of the oppositions you don't seem to have made very clear is the difference between age and youth. Now, my analysis is that with a very small majority voting leave, a considerable majority of that minority were elderly, with 500,000 people dying every year, how long will it be before the majority are Remainers, because a majority have left?
Right, let's keep going around. There's a gentleman just behind you. If you pass the mic to him. Thank you.
My question is related to Prime Minister May's visit to India, where she spoke about this bespoke visa, the preferential treatment that some people will get.
If you can speak into the microphone a little bit
Sorry.
more.
So there are some people who will get these preferential visas, people who are super rich. In fact, in an article it has in the Guardian today, it was compared to the 70s practice of these virginity tests. So comparing the discrimination, basically. So do you think there is this, push for a policy which will be more discriminatory and which will, make the country more the country will be welcoming, but to certain kinds of people, to people who are privileged, to people who are rich? And there's one more question I wanted to ask to Tom.
So just so we've all understood the question very well. So we've seen Theresa May go to India and India to ask for greater number of visas for highly skilled migrants. And
No, she spoke about these preferential treatments, preferential visas, these bespoke visas.
Bespoke preferential visas. So the question is then who gets them? And then we're according rights.
Them, and this will be a discriminatory, sort of push for a policy which will,
thank you.
Which
And the
will
second
be
question?
much more discriminatory. The other question is about refugees and non-refugees. So who do you consider refugees? Are these people who are coming from Syria who are sort of affected by war? There are people from Africa who come because of economic reasons. There are cases from different areas where people are leaving because of severe food shortages and all. So do you consider them as refugees as well?
So there's a sort of human rights case for economic migration under certain circumstances, for poverty as well as the sort of war and other issues. Great, let's pass the microphone to the gentleman in the yellow.
So I think you sort of touched on this earlier when one of you said that Brexit wasn't so much a British phenomenon as an English and Welsh phenomenon, with Scotland voting to remain. And I was wondering what your opinions were on why there's such a distinct difference between the attitudes of English and Welsh voters and the attitudes of Scottish voters in relation to the European Union and presumably by extension in relation to immigration, when these are all pretty much quite similar countries, very similar countries, demographically, culturally, economically.
Great. Any final questions? I think you've already asked one, so let me just ask the lady in the front here and the gentleman here, and then we'll come back to the panel for a final whip round. Thank you very much. The lady here in the colourful jumper.
My question more kind of relates to the idea that we're getting more kind of binary politics, maybe. So obviously we've got Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton being voted in now. But also just this idea that there seems to be quite a kind of binary view and this sort of sense of populism, which is kind of seen in quite a few countries now. So I know recently in Iceland, the Pirate Party have suddenly, blown out of proportion. So I was wondering if this is something that you envisage sort of happening more and more with this idea of political deglobalization.
So the rise of populist parties and whether that's something that we're going to keep seeing. Thank you very much. The gentleman in the check shirt here, the last question. I'll give the floor to Tom then.
A question primarily to David. David, you mentioned mass migration started, I think you said roughly 2002 or so. Has it continued at that high level evenly right through to 2016? And also, would you like the gross figures on immigration are rarely commented on in the press, from what I can see. Would you like to comment on the gross figures, which I think it's correct that 600,000 a year coming in from Europe, and if that changes anything?
So just to understand your question well, the numbers here and to what extent, I'm not sure I quite understood that.
Are the gross figures
as opposed to the net
important?
So should we be looking
Or
at
more
gross flows as
important
well as
than the net figure of the
Yeah.
300,000. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So let's go to Tom for your reflections on these and then any of the earlier questions as well. You've got quite a few there on sort of communitarian values and then who is the community and what are the salient questions about difference and trust.
Okay, let me try and be direct. So can I come back, Emily, on your first question about British identity? So British identity does exist. I live in Chipping Norton, which is in the Cotswolds. We have Boxing Day hunts and mince pies. We have civic religion. 600 people come to the Remembrance Day service, coming up on the coming Sunday. So it is, I think actually, I hope this is not inappropriate, David, I think the deeper liberal overreach is to have made certain kinds of claims unsayable in polite society. So somehow it feels spiky to say British identity exists, and it shouldn't be. And it's because it's been made to feel spiky that a lot of people have reacted against that. And I think a lot of the Leave vote, I myself voted Leave, I think a lot of the Leave vote was a reaction against being told sort of subliminally on the BBC that only stupid people vote for this.
But just to really understand this, so the presumption then is the sort of fox hunting, Chipping Norton values are then shared, and that is the Britishness. Because I mean, again, this is again sort of thinking third generation gypsies, for instance, or any other minority, how widely then those values are shared and recognised by all aspects of, or any citizen who would call themselves British, and how much we do have a kind of common sense of values. So I think that underlies a lot of this. And like you say, they're not easy questions for us to discuss, but I think they are really important ones.
So can I just give a little analogy? Imagine sitting around a dinner table with your family, and you've got some guests who are with you. There's certain parts of the conversation that begin to feel inappropriate in that context. If you spend too much time talking about, for instance, early events in your family's life, if you do this for too long, you actually cease to be welcoming to the people who are there. And it seems like something like this takes place in a nation's public conversation, that parts of a history of a nation, you don't want to be rude and you want to be welcoming to people for whom this is not part of their inheritance. And so there's a kind of, there can become a kind of alienation from your own history that then comes as a result of that. So I'm not saying clearly that there's one monochrome British identity and everyone shares and everyone is absolutely delighted about it. And there's clearly a diverse thing and there's regional identities, etc., etc. But in order for there to be a nation which is held together, there has to be something which is holding that together. And that's, in a sense, I regret that it's Brexit that's the prompt for this discussion, because each of us will have a home that is ours, and it's true of that home, of that culture, that these same facts are true. So let me just, there was a closely related question on borders. And so the borderline of nations and the identity of peoples clearly don't align. But I think, the evidence of history is that things are going to be more stable the closer that is. So one of the big objections to the end of empire is that the lines were drawn very, very badly. They failed to respect the demographic realities on the ground. So we want nations which are tolerant and respectful of and welcome minorities, what philosophers call persistent minorities, within their midst. But I think we shouldn't conclude from that therefore there's something divisive or exclusive about having a national narrative, a national sense of self that holds the country together.
Okay, does that answer your question there on boundaries? Yes or no? Somewhat, okay, good. Rob, some similar questions were asked to you about sort of these questions of communitarian values and perceptions.
Yeah, this gets us into the really fascinating realm of identity, and I'm glad that Tom mentioned dinner tables, because I'd like to start with a little analogy about a dinner table. One of the most frequently used measures in survey research of discriminatory prejudice is, would you be upset if your son or daughter brought home somebody from group X? And when you look at this measure over time, particularly amongst our friends, the people from nowhere, socially liberal graduates, the proportion who mind object to any kind of ethnic, religious, racial difference has steeply declined, and for younger generations is now close to zero. But there are other kinds of people that are friends of the people from nowhere really do mind. If your son brings home a UKIP voter to dinner, 75% object to that. That's going to be a pretty awkward dinner. That's worse on this measure than bringing home somebody with a criminal record. And that illustrates the point about identity, I think, which is that all of us are prone to divide the world into us and them. It's so basic to our programming. Henri Tajfel, who worked at the University of Sussex on this for decades, you could ask people whether they preferred a painting by Kandinsky or a painting by Klee, get them to run a few games together, and by the end of the day they preferred the people who liked the same painting as they did. It was that quick, that simple. So identity, us and them, is almost impossible to eliminate. But then you get this paradox that some kinds of identities, like Catholicism in America, Kennedy had a terrible time convincing Protestant Americans that it was okay to vote for a Protestant. Nobody even noticed that John Kerry was a Catholic. In 2 generations, it was gone. And yet in 20, 30, 40 generations, the divide between gypsies and non-gypsies in Eastern Europe, and similarly, the divide between Jews and Gentiles, just doesn't go. And that's one of the big mysteries in all this, is how do we go about making certain kinds of identities acceptable? You know, you are different to me in the beliefs that you have or the culture that you hold, but that's okay. And one of the issues I think that we have in terms of the difference between social liberals and social conservatives is I think social conservatives are more worried about this problem than social liberals tend to be. They're quicker to realise that this is a thing that's going to take a while to resolve, and therefore they want it slowed down, the changes that are associated with this. Whereas liberals tend to be very optimistic about this and say, hey, we'll embrace the difference and it'll be fine. And the truth is that both have a point. With all the best value divides in politics, both sides of the argument have a point. Yes, change is possible. The Catholics in America or in Scotland proved that change is possible. But yes, change doesn't always happen easily or automatically, and cases like the Gypsies show that as well. So it's a tough argument. And I don't have an answer, I'm just posing a bunch of interesting questions. Sorry, that's what academics do.
Very important ones, though, that we need to get to the bottom of. So let's get David and then to Madeleine.
I mean, just picking up on that, I mean, people forget that Senator McCarthy was Catholic, was an Irish Catholic. The Catholics very much wanted to join the system. McCarthyism was partly about the Irish Catholics claiming their place at the heart of patriotic American society. We tend to see it as an example of sort of political bullying, which it was too. But it was the Catholics of America saying, we are more patriotic than the Alger Hisses and all these WASPs. And both the Kennedys, both Jack and Bobby worked for Senator McCarthy. And it was a very important part, actually, of the integration of Catholics into the system. Gypsies do not want to join. I think it's a legitimate generalisation. They do not want to join. They're not desperate to join the system in the same way that the Catholics of America in the mid-20th century were. And that is true of one of the... integration becomes more difficult the more liberal you become, in a way. I mean, if you have a deeply embedded rights, you're quite an individualistic society, it's quite hard to create these narratives of integration, these narratives of belonging, and it wasn't helped by our history, partly derived from colonialism, of the lefties that took over the multiculturalism of the 60s, 70s and 80s didn't realise the extent to which they were reproducing colonial forms, but they very much were. In the kind of rough and ready 19th century, it was in some ways, it was kind of sink or swim. You came to this country, you had to join in. There was no option, really. We now give people the option, because we are a liberal society, of not joining in, and I think that is a price we pay for being a liberal society in some ways. But there are still things that we can do about it.
The analogy to empire, though, I think we were probably perhaps going outside as well, not giving quite as much preference to those whom we were sort of...
Well, I think we wanted to show the world after you know, we completely changed our view about empire without ever really having a great national debate about it. I think, you know, it went from something we were proud of to something we were rather ashamed of in the sort of 60s and the 70s, particularly people on the left.
Because I wanted to bring you in on this question of the gross figures and the net figures, and I wanted to come to Madeleine to round
Right, well, yeah, I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, the gross figures have been running for, I mean, almost 10 years, I think, at about 600,000 a year. But it's not just from Europe. These are gross figures from everywhere. And the net figure has, as Madeleine said at the beginning, is about 330,000 at the moment. I mean, it'll probably come down, partly as a result of Brexit and then partly as a result of the policy changes we make. I mean, in a way, I think the target the government set itself was a shame because it turned out to be so hard to reach. I mean, we had one government, the Labour government, that created really a mass immigration society without really meaning to and without asking anybody. They were then replaced by a government that said, it's all right, you know, we'll solve the problem, we'll bring the numbers down, and then didn't. So, I mean, but both of them sinned in slightly different ways. But interestingly enough, and this relates actually to the Gastarbeiter question, or the temporary citizen idea, as I prefer to call it, which is that actually, if you look at permanent residence, as I said earlier, we have a huge amount of churn, people coming for a year, 2 years, 3 years, students, you know, coming for 3 years, possibly staying on for a year, and they then go. And actually, if you look at the people who have been granted permanent residence, and in a way, you know, when we're talking about things like integration, they're the people that really matter, it's been down at 100,000. And in fact, last year, although there are technical reasons for this that Madeleine could explain, last year it was just 67,000. So actually, if the government had a permanent residence target rather than a net immigration target, then there wouldn't have been the same level of anxiety, I think, over the issue. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think you know, the temporary route is the way to go. It does mean it does mean reduced lower levels of rights, lower levels of access to the welfare state and so on. But that is precisely that's precisely the point of it. There is a huge anxiety about free riding, that particularly this great bulk of 50 or 60% of the population, the more settled people who place a high value on stability and continuity in their lives, you know, the non-liberal graduates, they also have they're very sensitive to free riding, and I think they look at the Romanian or Bulgarian builders in the corner of the pub who are, you know, who haven't learnt English and who they're not necessarily personally hostile to them, but they think that's the kind of wrong form. You know, if you come here, you know, join in or remain temporary. And it reduces their level of anxiety, because they're not thinking, these people are coming here and they're drawing on our sort of, you know, the emotional and financial aspect, as it were, of citizenship. If you can sort of leave them sort of outside the citizenship line, you know, they still have rights. I mean, you know, we're a modern liberal society. No one's going to be hostile to them, but it reduces the level of expectation on them, so they can come for a period, earn money, go home.
So let's bring Madeleine in on this then, and just sort of think, is that then the way forward to reconcile some of these sort of big questions? Is that where we need to be headed in policy terms?
Towards more temporary migration?
Yeah, is that the way to reconcile some of these differences and sort of concerns that we've heard from the kind of popular perception? Would that answer it?
I mean, I think it's very difficult. If your concern is, if you're trying to balance the different concerns of the desire to reduce net migration, which has become a very politically salient statistic, and the demands that employers, for example, have to access certain kinds of foreign labour force, then temporary migration it enables you to balance those in some ways, but it's really difficult to implement, partly enforcement of whether people go home, the fact that people don't build up skills over time, and so forth. So it feels like an easy solution. I'm not saying that it's the wrong thing to do, but it raises a lot of other questions that have to be. Can I ask the question on discrimination, though? Because this is something I think is really interesting, which is that when you think about immigration policy, this question comes up a lot. And one of the tricky things about it is that all immigration policy is essentially discrimination of a kind, in that we're saying some people get in and some people don't. As the question is, what are you discriminating on? There are some cases in which employers, for example, are required to discriminate against non-EU citizens who are applying for jobs. There is an expectation that they will hire a UK or an EU citizen in preference, rather than sponsoring someone to come on a visa. So I think there are big questions about what we discriminate on. If it's income, then this is happening all across the immigration system, particularly if you look at immigration for work. I mean, we discriminate on the basis of skills, on the basis of the salary that someone's going to earn. It's much more acceptable, people feel much more comfortable with it when we're talking about economic migration than when we get into family migration or refugees. But we also we have a lot of discrimination on nationality as well in our immigration system, which is something that's most closely associated with race, and so that's that's where it gets quite controversial. But we have a lot of discrimination in the system essentially because of our relationships with other countries, most obviously the European Union, which we have radically different immigration policies for EU citizens, for non-EU citizens. But there are cases when actually for good development reasons, for example, New Zealand has a policy that's widely praised by people in the development world that brings in people from specific Pacific Island countries in order to work in agriculture. That's discrimination too. It's done with mainly, partially altruistic motives in mind. So I think thinking about discrimination in immigration policy, it's actually really hard to unpick what is kind of good discrimination or bad discrimination, and to what extent we should be concerned about different kinds.
That's a very helpful thought then, that any immigration policy is in a way about those whom we exclude, and then on what grounds do we accord those rights to, and sort of draw that boundary. Thank you all. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank our panelists for very thoughtful reflections, for you for excellent questions.